Kharkiv, Soviet Union, January 1940. The air inside the Kharkiv locomotive factory was thick with the smell of oil, steel, and coal dust. Mikhail Koshkin, a wiry man in his early 40s, stood at a drafting table cluttered with blueprints, his hands smudged with pencil lead. His eyes, sharp but tired, traced the lines of a tank design that existed only on paper, a tank he believed could save the Soviet Union. Around him, the factory hummed with a clatter of machinery, but it was a deceptive sound. The Soviet war machine was faltering, its tanks outdated, its factories stretched thin by Stalin's purges and relentless quotas. Koshkin was no soldier. He was an engineer trained at the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, a man who believed in steel and mathematics. But he understood war. He had seen reports of German Panzer IIIs and IVs slicing through Poland in 1939, their 50mm guns and thick armor outmatching anything in the Soviet arsenal. The Red Army's T-26 and BT-7 tanks were relics, light, thinly armored, and undergunned. Koshkin's job as chief designer of the Kharkiv Design Bureau was to build something better, something revolutionary. He called it the T-34. The concept was radical. Koshkin envisioned a tank unlike any other, sloped armor to deflect shells, a diesel engine for reliability and fuel efficiency, and a rugged design that could be mass-produced despite the Soviet Union's industrial limitations. His team, a mix of young engineers and grizzled factory workers, gathered around the table as he explained. "The Germans build for precision," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "We can't match their factories, but we can build smarter. Armor that turns away shells without adding weight. An engine that runs on crude diesel, not scarce gasoline. A tank that fights in mud, snow, and dust." His deputy, Alexander Morozov, frowned at the blueprints. "Mikhail Ilyich, sloped armor? It's untested. The commissars will say it's too complex for our factories." Koshkin's jaw tightened. He knew the risks. The Soviet system didn't reward innovation, it punished failure. Stalin's purges had decimated the design bureau, with engineers vanishing into gulags for minor errors. But Koshkin had seen the intelligence reports. Germany was rearming. Time was running out. He began sketching the T-34's hull, explaining the math behind sloped armor. A 45-degree angle increases effective thickness without adding steel. A 60mm plate, sloped, resists like 100mm of flat armor. He tapped the blueprint. "This saves weight, saves steel, saves time." His team nodded, but their faces betrayed doubt. Soviet factories struggled to produce even basic tanks. Could they really build something this advanced? Koshkin's obsession with the T-34 had begun years earlier, when he worked on the T-26 and saw its limitations. The Red Army had thousands of tanks, but quantity meant nothing when German Panzers could punch through 30mm armor like paper. He studied captured German designs and American Christie tanks, whose suspension system inspired the T-34's wide tracks and rugged mobility. The Christie suspension, with its large road wheels and coiled springs, allowed the tank to cross rough terrain where others bogged down. Koshkin adapted it, simplifying the design for Soviet production. But the heart of the T-34 was its engine, the V2 diesel. Unlike gasoline engines, which caught fire easily, the V2 was tough, efficient, and could run on low-grade fuel. Koshkin's team had spent months refining it, testing prototypes in the factory's freezing courtyard. The engine produced 500 horsepower, enough to push the 26-ton tank at 50 kilometers per hour, a speed that rivaled lighter German designs. But the diesel's real advantage was its range, 300 kilometers on a single tank, compared to the Panzer III's 150 kilometers. As Koshkin worked late into the night, a factory foreman approached. "Comrade Koshkin, the commissar wants a progress report tomorrow. He says if the new tank isn't ready by summer, heads will roll." Koshkin didn't look up. "Then we'll build it by spring," he said, his voice calm but resolute. He knew the stakes. If the T-34 failed, it wouldn't just be his career. The Soviet Union's survival was on the line. Outside, snow fell on Kharkiv, blanketing the factory's rusted machinery. Koshkin stepped into the cold, lighting a cigarette. He thought of his wife, Vera, and their daughters, waiting at home. He hadn't seen them in weeks. The T-34 consumed him, every calculation, every weld, every rivet. He exhaled, watching his breath mingle with the smoke. Somewhere across the border, German factories were churning out Panzers. He had to be faster, smarter, better. The Kharkiv factory was a chaos of sparks and shouting. It was spring 1940, and the T-34 prototype was taking shape. Koshkin moved through the assembly line, his coat dusted with metal shavings. Workers hammered steel plates, their hands calloused, their faces gaunt from long shifts. The factory was understaffed. Stalin's purges had claimed foremen, engineers, even welders. Those who remained worked under the shadow of suspicion, knowing a single mistake could mean a one-way trip to Siberia. Koshkin knelt beside the T-34's chassis, inspecting the sloped armor. The concept was simple but revolutionary. By angling the steel plates, incoming shells would glance off rather than penetrate. He ran his fingers along a weld, checking for imperfections. "This seam must be flawless," he told a young welder, Ivan, who nodded nervously. "A weak weld is a dead crew." Ivan adjusted his torch, sweat beading on his forehead. He was 19, barely trained, but the factory had no one else. The T-34's design was a balancing act. Sloped armor saved weight, but it required precise cutting and welding, skills in short supply. The V2 diesel engine was another challenge. Its 12 cylinders, arranged in a V shape, were cast from aluminum to reduce weight, but Soviet foundries struggled to produce consistent parts. Koshkin's team had to redesign components on the fly, simplifying where possible without sacrificing performance. "We don't have German precision," Koshkin told Morozov, "but we have ingenuity. We make it work." The Christie suspension was a point of pride. Koshkin had studied American designs and adapted their wide tracks and large wheels for the T-34. The suspension absorbed shocks, allowing the tank to traverse mud, snow, and rocky terrain. During a test, Koshkin watched the prototype climb a frozen embankment that had stalled a BT-7. "This is what wins wars," he said, clapping a colleague on the back. "Not just guns, but movement." The T-34's 76.2 mm gun was another breakthrough. Most Soviet tanks carried 45 mm guns, ineffective against modern armor. The T-34's F-34 gun could fire high-velocity shells capable of piercing 60 mm of steel at 1,000 meters. Koshkin had pushed for this gun, despite resistance from commissars who wanted cheaper, lighter weapons. "A tank that can't kill is a coffin," he argued, and eventually won. But the political pressure was relentless. One evening, a commissar named Petrov arrived, his NKVD badge gleaming. "Comrade Koshkin," he said, his voice cold, "the Politburo expects results. Your predecessor was unreliable. Don't repeat his mistakes." Koshkin knew what that meant. His predecessor had been arrested for sabotage after a prototype failed. He nodded, saying nothing, but his stomach churned. He hadn't slept properly in months. His cough, persistent since winter, was getting worse. At home, Vera noticed the change. "Mikhail, you're killing yourself," she said one night, her voice soft but firm. "The tank isn't worth your life." Koshkin smiled weakly. "It's not just a tank, Vera. It's the future." He didn't tell her about the NKVD's threats or the rumors of German troops massing on the border. He didn't want to worry her, but he couldn't stop. The T-34 was his obsession, his legacy. By May 1940, the first prototype was ready for testing. Koshkin stood in the factory yard as the T-34 rumbled to life, its diesel engine roaring. The tank's sloped turret gleamed under the sun, its tracks biting into the dirt. Workers cheered, but Koshkin's eyes were on the details. The suspension's flex, the turret's rotation, the engine's vibration. "It's not enough to build it," he told Morozov. "We have to prove it." The Red Army demanded a demonstration in Moscow, 2,000 kilometers away. Koshkin proposed driving the prototype there himself, through snow and mud, to show its durability. His team protested. Such a journey was unheard of for an untested tank. But Koshkin was resolute. "If I don't believe in it, why should they?" he said. He climbed into the driver's seat, his cough rattling in his chest. The T-34 rolled forward, and Koshkin felt a surge of pride. This was his creation, his weapon, his hope. The road from Kharkiv to Moscow was a frozen hell. It was March 1940, and Koshkin sat hunched in the T-34's driver compartment, his hands numb on the controls. Snow whipped across the windshield, obscuring the path. The prototype groaned as it climbed a muddy hill, its tracks clawing for grip. Inside, Koshkin, Morozov, and two mechanics endured the bone-rattling ride, their breath visible in the unheated cabin. The T-34 was untested, its welds fresh, its engine barely broken in. But Koshkin had insisted on this journey. "If it can't survive this," he said, coughing into his sleeve, "it won't survive war." The T-34 was a beast, but it wasn't perfect. The suspension creaked under the strain of 26 tons, and the transmission occasionally slipped. Koshkin made mental notes, shouting observations to Morozov over the engine's roar. "The clutch needs reinforcement," he yelled as the tank lurched through a ditch. Morozov scribbled in a notebook, his face pale from a cold. The V2 diesel engine, however, was a marvel. It ran smoothly, sipping fuel where a gasoline engine would have stalled. Koshkin marveled at its resilience, even as his own body weakened. The journey was punishing. Blizzards forced them to stop, repairing frozen components by torchlight. Mud clogged the tracks, requiring hours of cleaning. At one point, the turret's traverse mechanism jammed, and Koshkin climbed out in -20 degrees Celsius to inspect it. His coat soaked through. His cough worsened, a deep, hacking sound that alarmed Morozov. "Mikhail Ilyich, let me drive," he pleaded. Koshkin waved him off. "I designed it. I drive it." The T-34's design shone through the ordeal. Its wide tracks distributed weight, preventing it from sinking into mud like older Soviet tanks. The sloped armor, though untested in combat, gave Koshkin confidence. He imagined a German 37mm shell striking the hull, sliding harmlessly off the angled steel. The 76.2mm gun, still untested, promised devastating firepower. Koshkin's calculations suggested it could penetrate any German tank at 500 meters. But calculations weren't enough. He needed to show the Red Army. In Moscow, a crowd of generals and commissars awaited. Koshkin drove the T-34 onto a proving ground, its hull caked in mud, its engine still warm. The generals were skeptical. "It's too heavy," one said. "Too complex," said another. Koshkin climbed out, shivering, and began his presentation. "This tank moves faster than a Panzer III, hits harder, and survives hits that would destroy our T-20 SXS, he said, his voice hoarse. He pointed to the sloped armor. "This deflects shells. This engine runs on diesel, not gasoline. This tank will fight when others fail." A test followed. The T-34 charged across the field, climbing obstacles that stalled other tanks. Its gun fired, shattering a target 800 meters away. The generals murmured approval, but the commissars remained stone-faced. "Can your factories build it?" one asked. Koshkin nodded, hiding his doubts. Soviet factories were chaotic, plagued by shortages and untrained workers. But he had no choice. "We'll build it," he said. The journey back to Kharkiv was worse. Koshkin's cough turned into a fever, and he collapsed halfway, forcing Morozov to take over. By the time they reached the factory, Koshkin was bedridden, his lungs ravaged. Doctors diagnosed pneumonia, likely worsened by the grueling drive. Vera sat by his side, her face etched with worry. "You did it, Mikhail," she whispered. They approved the tank. Koshkin smiled faintly, but his mind was on the factory. Production had to start. Germany was coming. June 1941. The T-34 was in production, but the world was collapsing. German tanks rolled across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, smashing through Red Army defenses. Koshkin, confined to a hospital bed, listened to radio reports with growing dread. The Wehrmacht's Panzer IIIs and IVs were cutting through T-20 SXS and BT-7s like knives through butter. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled, destroyed, or captured. The T-34 was the Red Army's only hope, but production was painfully slow. The Kharkiv factory was a madhouse. Workers toiled 18-hour shifts, assembling T-34s with whatever materials they could scrounge. Steel was scarce, and quality control was non-existent. Morozov, now leading the design team, struggled to maintain Koshkin standards. Mikhail Ilyich would never allow these welds, he muttered, inspecting a hull with visible cracks. But there was no time. German bombers were targeting Kharkiv, and the factory was ordered to relocate to the Urals, 1,000 kilometers east. The evacuation was chaos. Entire assembly lines were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped under Luftwaffe attacks. Workers, including women and teenagers, carried tools and blueprints through burning streets. Koshkin, too weak to help, dictated instructions from his bed. "Simplify the turret casting," he told Morozov. "We can't afford delays." His voice was a whisper, but his resolve was iron. By September 1941, Koshkin's health had deteriorated. Pneumonia had weakened his heart, and doctors gave him weeks to live. He spent his final days sketching improvements to the T-34, his hands trembling. "The gun needs more range," he murmured to Vera. "The armor can be thicker." On September 26, 1941, Mikhail Koshkin died, never seeing his tank in combat. But his legacy was rolling off the assembly lines. In the Urals, the relocated factory, now called Uralvagonzavod, began producing T-34s in earnest. Workers slept in tents, enduring minus 30 degrees Celsius winters. Steel arrived irregularly, often low-grade. Yet the T-34's design shone through. Its simplicity, fewer parts, rugged construction, allowed production to continue despite shortages. By late 1941, hundreds of T-34s were reaching the front, their sloped armor and 76.2 mm guns a shock to German commanders. A young tank commander, Lieutenant Ivan Petrov, took command of a T-34 near Moscow. He marveled at its power, the diesel engine's growl, the gun's thunder. In December 1941, during the Soviet counteroffensive, his T-34 faced a Panzer III. The German shell glanced off the sloped armor, leaving only a scorch mark. Petrov fired back, the 76.2 mm shell punching through the Panzer's turret. "This is Koshkin's tank," he thought, grinning. "This changes everything." Near Smolensk, October 1941. German Major Hans Weber, a Panzer officer, stood beside a wrecked T-34, its tracks blown off, but its hull intact. The tank had appeared out of nowhere, ambushing his Panzer IIIs and destroying 3 before a lucky shot disabled it. Weber, an engineer by training, was tasked with analyzing the wreck. As he climbed onto the hull, his heart sank. This was no ordinary tank. Weber began with the armor. The slope plates were unlike anything in German designs. He measured the angle, 45 degrees, and calculated the effective thickness. "This is equivalent to 90 mm of flat armor," he muttered to his aide, Lieutenant Schmidt. "Our 37 mm guns are useless." He examined a shell mark where a German round had glanced off, leaving only a dent. The T-34's 60 mm sloped armor was outperforming the Panzer IV's 50 mm flat plates. The V2 diesel engine was another shock. Weber's team removed the access panel, revealing the rugged, compact design. "This runs on diesel," he said, incredulous. No radiator to puncture, no gasoline to ignite. The engine simplicity was staggering. No complex components, no delicate machining. It was built for mass production, unlike Germany's finicky Maybach engines. Weber's calculations estimated 500 horsepower, enough to drive the 26-ton tank at speeds rivaling lighter Panzers. The 76.2 mm gun was the final blow. Weber inspected the barrel, noting its length and bore. "This can penetrate our tanks at twice the range of our 50 mm guns," he told Schmidt. He found spent shell casings nearby, their high velocity design capable of punching through 70 mm of steel at 500 meters. German tanks, with their thin armor, were sitting ducks. Weber's report to his commanders was grim. "The T-34 is a technological leap," he wrote. Its armor, mobility, and firepower outclass our Panzers. Soviet production appears capable of deploying these in large numbers. He recommended immediate upgrades to German tanks, longer guns, thicker armor. But he knew the truth. German factories, already stretched, couldn't match this level of simplicity and scale. On the Soviet side, the T-34 was turning the tide. Near Moscow, T-34s led counterattacks, their wide tracks navigating snow where Panzers bogged down. German crews nicknamed them steel monsters, their shells bouncing harmlessly off the sloped armor. One German officer, after losing his platoon to a single T-34, wrote, "We fired everything we had, and it kept coming. It's unstoppable." Weber's analysis echoed Schultz's in the competitor's script. He saw the T-34 not just as a tank, but as evidence of Soviet industrial resolve. Germany had underestimated the Red Army, assuming their factories were primitive. But the T-34 was proof of something else, a system that could build effective weapons under impossible conditions. Nizhny Tagil, Ural Mountains, 1942. The Ural Vagonzavod factory was a sprawling fortress of steel and smoke. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, toiled in freezing sheds, assembling T-34s under flickering lights. Maria Ivanova, a 22-year-old welder, worked 16-hour shifts, her hands scarred from burns. "This is Koshkin's tank," her foreman told her. "Every weld saves a soldier." Maria didn't know Koshkin, but she felt his presence in the blueprints she followed. The T-34's design was a miracle of simplicity. Its sloped armor required fewer plates than traditional designs, saving steel. The V-2 engine used cast parts, not precision-machined ones, allowing untrained workers to assemble it. The Christie suspension, with its bolt-on wheels, was easy to repair. This simplicity allowed the factory to produce 1,000 T-34s a month by mid-1942, despite German air raids and material shortages. But the human cost was immense. Workers lived on bread and thin soup, their fingers frostbitten from handling cold steel. Maria's friend, Anna, lost a hand when a press malfunctioned. Yet they kept working, driven by fear of the NKVD and pride in their tank. "The Germans fear it," Maria whispered to Anna one night. "That's worth everything." On the front, T-34s were rewriting the rules of tank warfare. Their wide tracks allowed them to maneuver in mud, where Panzers sank. Their diesel engines ran longer, reducing the need for scarce fuel. Soviet commanders, like General Dmitry Lelyashenko, began using T-34s in massed formations, overwhelming German lines. At Stalingrad, T-34s encircled the German 6th Army, their 76.2 mm guns blasting through Panzer IVs. German engineers scrambled to respond. The Panzer IV's new 75 mm long barrel gun, introduced in 1942, could penetrate the T-34 at close range, but production lagged. The Tiger I, with its 88 mm gun, was a threat, but only 1,300 were built compared to over 50,000 T-34s. The Soviet tank's simplicity and numbers overwhelmed German quality. Maria, welding a T-34's turret, thought of her brother, a tank driver on the front. She didn't know if he was alive, but every tank she built felt like a letter to him. "Stay alive," she whispered, striking an arc. The T-34 was more than a machine. It was hope forged in steel. Kursk, July 1943. The Battle of Kursk was the largest tank battle in history, and the T-34 was its star. Lieutenant Ivan Petrov, now a veteran, commanded a T-34-76 in the 5th Guards Tank Army. His tank, nicknamed Koshkin's Revenge, roared across the steppe, its 76.2 mm gun blazing. German Tigers and Panthers, with their superior guns, were deadly, but the T-34s outnumbered them 10 to 1. Petrov's crew worked like a machine, loader, gunner, driver, all moving in sync. The T-34's sloped armor saved Petrov's life multiple times. A Panther's 75 mm shell struck his turret, glancing off with a deafening clang. "Keep moving," Petrov shouted, his driver swerving through smoke. His gunner fired, the shell punching through a Panzer IV's hull. The Germans were learning to fear the T-34, but they couldn't stop it. Soviet tactics, mass charges, ambushes, leveraged the tank's numbers and mobility. On the German side, Colonel Friedrich Müller, a Panzer commander, watched his division crumble. His Panther tanks were powerful, but their engines overheated and spare parts were scarce. The T-34s kept coming, wave after wave, their tracks chewing through mud and dust. Müller's radio crackled with reports. T-34s at 500 meters. They're flanking us. He fired his 75mm gun, destroying a T-34, but 3 more appeared. Where are they getting these tanks? He muttered. The T-34's psychological impact was immense. German soldiers called it the beast, its sloped silhouette a harbinger of death. Soviet crews, emboldened by its reliability, pushed harder, knowing their tank could take hits and keep fighting. At Prokhorovka, a clash of 1,500 tanks, T-34s overwhelmed German armor through sheer numbers. The battle marked a turning point, breaking the Wehrmacht's offensive power. Petrov's tank survived Kursk, though its hull was scarred. As he cleaned the barrel, he thought of Koshkin, a name whispered among tankers. He built this, Petrov told his crew. He gave us a chance. The T-34 wasn't perfect, its optics were crude, its transmission finicky, but it was enough. It was everywhere. Berlin, 1945. The war was lost, and Colonel Friedrich Müller sat in a ruined command post, staring at captured Soviet documents. Among them was a report on the T-34 detailing its production. Over 50,000 built by 1945, more than all German tanks combined. Müller, who had survived Kursk, felt a bitter respect. The T-34 wasn't just a tank. It was a symbol of Soviet resilience. Germany's factories, bombed and overstretched, couldn't match it. The Panther and Tiger were superior in quality, but quality didn't matter when the enemy had 10 tanks for your one. Müller thought back to 1941, when he first encountered the T-34. He had dismissed it as crude, a product of a backward nation. But its simplicity was its strength. The sloped armored diesel engine and rugged tracks were designed for a war of attrition, not precision. The Soviets had outproduced Germany, just as America had outproduced Germany in the competitor's P-47 story. Müller's report to his superiors in 1942, warning of the T-34's dominance, had been ignored, much like Schultz's P-47 report. Crude but effective, he had written. We cannot match their numbers. His superiors called him a pessimist, blinded by Nazi ideology. Mikhail Koshkin never lived to see his tanks triumph. His death in 1940 from pneumonia contracted during the Moscow test drive was a quiet tragedy. But his T-34 reshaped the Eastern Front. It stopped the German advance at Moscow, encircled the 6th Army at Stalingrad, and crushed the Wehrmacht at Kursk. By 1945, T-34s were rolling into Berlin, their tracks grinding over the rubble of the Third Reich. In the Urals, Maria Ivanova heard the war was over. She stood beside a T-34, its hull freshly painted, and wept. Her brother had died in a T-34 near Stalingrad, but his letters praised the tank's strength. Koshkin's tank saved us, he wrote. Maria touched the sloped armor, feeling the welds she had made. The T-34 was her brother's tomb, but also his vengeance. The T-34's legacy was staggering. Over 84,000 were built during the war, dwarfing Germany's 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. Its design influenced tanks for decades, from the Korean War to the Cold War. Koshkin's vision, simplicity, durability, mass production, had won an industrial war Germany couldn't fight. Like Schultz with the P-47, Koshkin's successors saw the truth. The side with more steel, more fuel, and more would win. The Soviets had all three. Müller closed the Soviet report, his hands trembling. The T-34 was proof of Germany's strategic failure. The Nazis believed in quality, in racial superiority, in willpower. But Koshkin's tank, born from necessity and ingenuity, proved them wrong. It wasn't just a machine. It was mathematics, forged in steel, rolling over ideology.